My research is about people, and we can't get away from the fact that actually this is an issue which affects people. I started researching this topic back in 1999. One of the things that people always say to me is that, well, you know, if we hadn't had 9/11, this thing would never have happened, we wouldn't have had this. Well, actually, you know, if you go back to my research in 1999, what we saw there was we saw that there was actually a growing sense that Muslims were being discriminated against. You know, that Muslimness was becoming something that people could target in terms of their discrimination, their prejudice and so on. And also at this time in the 90s, there was this growing recognition that actually Muslims as a multi-ethnic grouping were not protected under existing legislation. So if you look at race relations legislation, what you had was you had protection for mono-ethnic religious groups such as Sikhs and Jews, whereas Muslims, Buddhists, Christians and so on, the actual legislation didn't offer protection. So you cannot serve Muslims in your shops and it's perfectly legal. You can say to someone, I'm not going to serve you because you're Muslim. You can't say, I'm not going to serve you because you're Pakistani, because the race relations legislation protects against that. But in terms of religion, it wasn't protected. So you see there that there was a loophole in the legislation. Some of that legislation has been sort of changed. But over the years, you know, but when I first started looking at this, it wasn't a sexy topic at all. Nobody was really interested in it. There was no sort of real move towards it. And in academic circles as well, there was no sort of idea around sort of looking at this. So I started in religious studies. I moved through theology, through Islamic studies, through sociology, now into social policy. And I think that what that shows is that in terms of that story, is the fact that this has become a much more highly politicised issue as in 2012 than what it was in 1999 when I first began to look at this. I'm going to take us back to 2002. This was a piece of research that I was commissioned to do with my colleague Jürgen Nielsen. And it was after 9/11. We was commissioned by the European Parliament to look at the backlash that was taking place across Europe. You know, to look at what was going on in each of the 15 EU countries as it was at the time. And some of the stuff that we found out was that across all 15 of those states, there was a backlash against Muslims. You know, as it says there, they become indiscriminate victims. Now, if you think about that, you know, if you go to somewhere like Germany or France or Britain, you can walk down most of the streets of most cities, and actually you can see someone who looks Muslim, or you can see someone you think would be Muslim. It's relatively easy to do. I could look around this room today, and I could pick out, you know, 10, 15 people that I think, you know, I could look at and go, yeah, probably Muslim. But also in that 15, there was countries such as Finland, where Muslims are invisible. In Luxembourg, where the number of Muslims are tiny. There's no visible signs to it. There's no outward features. In Luxembourg, for example, there's no mosques. There's just an Islamic centre, which is a kind of youth centre, where people go and pray sometimes. But again, it's a very small community. What we saw across all 15 states was a backlash. People thinking that because some Muslims in one part of the world have done something which is a terrible atrocity, there's a right to take revenge on indiscriminate, innocent Muslims in another completely different place. And we saw that right across 15 countries. And what we see there is we see everything from verbal abuse to threats, spitting, hijabs being pulled off their heads, physical abuse, graffiti, arson. It wasn't just about Muslims, it was about the kind of material emphasis as well. So mosques, Islamic schools, Muslim businesses, all these places. Visuality, the kind of visible appearance of Muslims was very, very strong. When somebody feels enraged enough to go out onto the street and attack a Muslim at random because something terrible has happened in New York, how are you going to direct that? How are you going to channel that anger? Well, you need to be able to differentiate. You need to look at somebody and go, okay, that's a Muslim, that's not, so I'm going to attack this one. I'm going to take my revenge out on this individual. And what we saw there was that the visual aspect of Muslims was very, very key. And of course, when we talk about visual aspect, the way Muslim women look, you can't get away from the fact that Muslim women tend to be, on the whole, one of the most easily recognisable groups within society. There's visible signs that you can look at and you can target them straight away. And then the second part was, of course, the Muslim women. Muslim women right across Europe became the primary focus for attack. And there's a few incidents there, I don't know if you can see them, but there's a few from across it. In Britain, an 18-year-old woman was attacked by men wielding baseball bats. This was in Slough. In Denmark, a Muslim woman was thrown from a taxi. In Italy, a Muslim woman was shutting the doors of a bus, whilst people on the bus cheered and people at the bus stop cheered. If you try and think about people, if you try and come back to that idea about yourself as a human being, as a normal person, does this sound rational that you want to, that you would do this sort of thing? But what we see there is we see this idea that right across Europe, Muslim difference in the form of Muslim women and the way they look become very, very common, very big issue in terms of that. The media is both contentious and debatable. If somebody reads an article in the Daily Express, for example, which is highly inflammatory, and then walks out onto the street and sees a Muslim woman and pulls the hijab from her head and spits upon her, how do you prove that? How do you prove that that person was so incensed by that article that actually the consequence was that attack? And also when you talk to the media and they'll say, well, that was, even if you can prove that, that's one person out of millions that read our newspaper every day. So actually that percentage is very, very small. So the media is very, very contentious. And when you try and raise these issues about the representation of Muslims and Islam in the media, you come up against a brick wall, really. Because you can't really challenge that. You can't really prove that people are influenced or move on there. But what you can say is that is the way in which researchers show that actually the media shapes people's views. It shapes their understanding. The media informs into what we know or what we don't know. So it moves us into there. So it gives us a worldview that we understand. If the media tells us, actually we will take that. We will believe it. It's there if we understand that. And a steady stream of stories and so on. There's never a photo thrown in for no reason. The photos are there to actually tell you what the article is about. Then it is problematic for a lot of people. And a lot of people in Britain don't like the face value. They don't like this idea of not being able to see who they're engaging with and who they're not engaging with. There's probably, there's a legitimate right to sort of talk about the idea of, is it right to have teachers or teaching assistants wearing a face veil? Because of kids, like how would they interact? What will be the... But actually we can't have these debates because the fact of the matter is it's so highly emotive. And you get these statements, you get the polar opposites screaming at each other. And actually the safe space in the middle where you want to have these debates, because it's not black and white. Actually it's a grey issue. It's not black and white. So actually what I'm saying is, we actually need to find spaces to have these discussions. Well, I don't like this, and this is the reason why. And actually, this is why I wear this. And I think that those debates, there's a really, really valid and really necessary time that we need to have these sort of debates. But because of the way in which politics works, the political spaces, the media and so on, we don't actually get that space. We don't actually get that interaction to be able to talk about that. So again, I think that this is a safe space where we can raise this sort of stuff. Actually, it's not controversial at all because it's actually thought through and seen to be something that we should be doing. You choose freedom or Islam. The two can never meet. The idea is that, this is Islam against the West. This is the West against Islam. And the two will never come together. So the way in which the image of Muslim women has been used over the past 10 years is becoming very, very embedded. If we saw an image of the newspaper, if I was standing here, I can't really see that screen too well, but if I was looking across there and there was the Daily Mail or the Daily Star, and I saw an image there with a Muslim woman, closely cropped, a niqab, you can just see her eyes, I can immediately say that front page story is about Muslims and them being a problem. Muslims have caused trouble. I don't even need to read the article. I can say that straight away. And that's the immediacy that this image now has for people. So when we talk about that vibe, that kind of informing the way in which people understand things and think, that's really where I'm kind of coming from in terms of that. Yeah, you can do that. Okay, and also as well, the idea that extremism breeds extremism. And so let's not forget, that these groups, so groups like Al-Majaroon or whatever they've become since, they've been banned and reinvented and so on, and groups such as the EDL, these groups need each other. Without one, you wouldn't have the other. They feed off each other. And I'll give you an example of a few years ago. There was the first time a poppy was burned. It was burned in on Hyde Park Corner on a Thursday morning. I don't know if anybody knows Hyde Park Corner, but it's a really busy area of London. People are not going to be there. All of a sudden you had a Muslim group on one side, burning a poppy, and on the other side you had the EDL, the English Defence League. Now, surely if there wasn't any collusion, how did those two groups both turn up at exactly the same place, exactly the same time, and also have media cameras filming it? So there has to be some collusion in terms of that. And this just came out from West Midlands Police, this was a couple of years ago. And they said that after groups such as the EDL have been to areas and have actually marched and complained and protested and so on, what you have is those from within Muslim groups actually moving into these areas and feeding off the back of the messages of the far right, that Islam and the West can never fit together, can never come together, and you have some of those more radical Muslim groups as well going into those areas, reinforcing exactly the same message, saying this is how the West think about you, this is how the British think about you, this is how the white population think about you. We can never live together. So actually, we should sit in opposition. Okay, so in terms of the media, I want to give you some of this stuff in terms of this. We did some research in 2007, which looked at every national newspaper every day for a week. And we monitored this, and people say, well, actually, what do you mean? So we said it was a normal week. And so when we say that, what we mean is there was no big Muslim story. There was no terror raids, there was no bombs going off, there was there was nothing. The biggest new Muslim story that week was Prince Nazim was convicted of manslaughter for when he killed some people in a car crash. And it said on a number of occasions, Prince Nazim, Muslim boxer. Interestingly, he'd been a British boxer when he was winning fights, but suddenly he became a Muslim boxer when there was something wrong. And what we saw in that week was that when we looked at this, there was around 352 articles about Muslims or Islam. This, when we compared that to research that had been done in 1996, there'd been a 260% increase in the stories about Muslims and Islam in the British national press. So what we see is this huge newsworthy interest in Muslims and Islam. Given that the population is over 60 million and that only 3 million are Muslim, that's going to be an amazing overthrow of a population of 57 million people overthrown by 3 million. It's probably going to be the greatest act of overthrow in the history of mankind. This is a Muslim woman who we interviewed in Birmingham. Whether we like it or not, we are the 7/7 bombers. We are the ones who brought down the Twin Towers. We are Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. That's how people see us. We're the new Jews, we're the new blacks. And as she went on, whether we like it or not, that's how people see us. These are people's actual words. And so when we talk about people, for me this is about an issue of equality, about an issue of fairness, and about an issue of social justice. And I think that if we look at this from that point of view, from that perspective, actually I think Islamophobia becomes something that we can much more buy into and understand and think about and take forward and and try and rationalise that and deal with it, rather than seeing as civilization.